speaker is Kristen Wedding. She is the Deputy Director and Fellow at Csis for the Global Food Security Project, and she works on policy issues related to that issue. And you all have her bio, so I will, since we're running short, I will hand it over to you.
Sure.
Okay? Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks. Great, thank you. It's great to be here with you today. I've gotten a quick background on what the program is about, and I wanted to just start by saying that I greatly respect your profession, and the reason I'm doing international affairs is largely because of my high school experience. So I think it's great that you guys are all taking on these issues. I'll just give you a quick overview about CSIS before I launch into some of the food security work we do. Basically, we're a nonprofit think tank that covers foreign policy. We're nonpartisan, and we cover all issues we cover all regions of the world, and then we cover a lot of cross-cutting issues. So we cover national security, global trends, so food security being one, but also demographics, global health, energy, terrorism. We kind of cover the gamut of everything. And we have about 200 people on staff that work on all of these issues, and then we're largely funded by a mix of organizations, so by the U.S. government, by the corporate world. It's about a third of each of those, and then private foundations and individual donations. So we try to be pretty balanced in the recommendations we put out, and since our funding is from such a big variety, we know there's no way we're going to make everyone happy. So it serves to be in our best interest to be balanced. So I first wanted to just start out talking a little bit about food security and basically giving you a little bit of a definition of what it is. I think you hear the word tossed out a lot in the news these days, but I think it means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And there's 4 big components to food security. It's food availability, so having enough food and that you would like to eat. Then having food access, so having the economic and physical means to procure the food and cook the food and eat it. And then utilization is knowing what kinds of foods you need to have a nutritious diet and how to prepare them, and then having also the water and energy and sort of those necessary inputs to produce the food. And then finally is stability, so having these things over time. It does no good if one day you can afford food and you can just run down to the market, when the next day you don't know if that market will be there or if food will be costing 3 times as much. So that's the big driver over time, is having all of these things being stable. First, I want to give an overview of the current state of food around the world, and there's a few big pieces of this: demographics, prices, supply and demand. So over the next, until 2050, we plan to add a little over 2 billion people to the world. So the big challenge is a resource challenge with food. How do we feed 9.3 billion people on essentially the same amount of land and not using more water or energy? It's really a big resource constraint. And I think you heard a little bit this morning about some of the other resource constraints, so this is just one piece of it. Aside from the world getting larger, it will be rapidly urbanizing. Almost all new population growth will be in urban areas, and almost all of it, as you can see, will take place in Asia and Africa. We are expected to rise, the urban population between now and 2050 is expected to rise from 3.3 billion to 6.4 billion. So 70% of the world's population will live in urban areas. In addition to the world urbanizing, we expect wealth to increase. As people's income moves from $2 a day to $10 a day, people's food preferences change. So you go from eating staple crops, from eating cassava in Africa or maize, corn, wheat, to preferring more dairy, meat, and fruits and vegetables. Once you are able to once your income rises over $10 a day, you see basically a much more Western diet where people consume more packaged goods, more processed foods, pre-made frozen foods, things of that nature.
Is that
Yes.
because of the urbanization?
It's because of the urbanization and because of the income. I think largely as people have more money, that's one of the first choices they make in what they eat. It's just what we've seen in the past. So when you're surviving on less than $2 a day, you're going to eat whatever's cheapest, whatever will keep you alive. And then as you get more money, you're going to demand higher quality goods. So yes.
So is that because of the move from the rural farm areas to the
That
cities where they can possibly get better jobs and,
Yes.
and make more money?
And
to
that's
eat
where
better?
incomes will be rising, exactly.
So when you're talking about incomes rising by 2050, is that real income adjusted for inflation
yes.
and other world events? Because I'm
Yes.
wondering how.
Yeah, and when I
from 2 to
talk about
10
the food prices, I'll show you a little bit about how both the nominal and the nominal and the real food prices have changed over time. I mean, they very closely mirror each other, but yes, we expect real incomes to increase over time. So whether it's $2 a day, that's just the number we use now. That will obviously change in the future.
Yeah, I think what you're saying here, we're seeing in China right now, right in America,
Yes.
where there's so much demand for meat
Yes.
to be packaged and sent over there because their wealth and growth is causing a big demand for meat from this.
Yeah,
country.
one of the biggest imports or exports that we send to China is pork, is hogs for pork production. So there are definitely, you can see that right now, the rise in China for meat and higher quality food goods. Aside from all of this demand in food increasing, we're still seeing large amounts of hunger. There's close to 1 billion people that go hungry every day, and we're really not seeing a decrease in that number. Last year, I think this estimate was revised just slightly, but it's still staggering, the fact that there's 1 million people that are malnourished and hungry every day. And then on the opposite side of the coin, skipped one. So the 65% of the world's hungry are in just 7 countries. So in China, the DRC, Bangladesh, Indonesia, Pakistan, and Ethiopia.
And India.
Sure. And India. I'm sorry. I missed that. Yes. Here, I can go back.
Okay, China and India belong to what's called the BRIC countries, who have
Yes.
the most rapid and the largest developing economies that are going on right now, even
Yes.
outstripping or making competition with the U.S. Why would, or maybe I'm not
No, it's
reading
fine.
it correctly, but what percentage of the hunger would be in China and India because of their growing
They're-
economies and they have the ability not to have hunger?
Rural
They do.
urbanization.
Part of the big problem is that these are overall figures. So when you see the numbers for China or India and their wealth that are dramatically increasing, it's occurring at such a small segment of the society. So if you take the mean of it, yes, they're growing and incomes are rising rapidly, but you still have huge segments of the population where the wealth is not trickling down. These societies are very divided, and so you have a few people holding most of the wealth. And so you'll have, in India, for example, you'll see, right next to huge new beautiful condos and people driving brand new cars, you'll see the slums. So it's these huge disparities that are not being corrected. And a lot of that happens more at the political level. That's not really a resource issue. It's an issue for governments to take on, for social safety nets, for education, for those types of issues. So this is just looking at trends more in aggregate.
But would this hunger be more urbanized than rural? Because rural, you can put something in the ground
Yes.
and get something to eat it yourself, and you can subsist
Yes.
maybe with the $2 figure within You wouldn't die of starvation.
Right. A lot of the poor are in urban centers. I mean, a lot of the starving are in urban centers. And then for subsistence farmers, yes, they create enough food usually to feed themselves. But then if there's a drought or, extreme weather event, then they're wiped out, and then they also go hungry. And subsisting is not necessarily being food secure. If you're eating the same crop every day and getting just enough calories to live, if you're eating the same thing every day, you're eating wheat every day, you're eating maize every day, you're not getting a diverse diet, you're not getting healthy nutrients. So it's not really a situation of food security if you're only able to subsist on one crop, if that's all you're growing. Yes?
This is just fascinating. When the folks that are working on food security are defining hungry, how are they defining it? Because what you were talking about people subsisting on ugali or fufu, the maize part in different parts of Sub-Saharan Africa. There are people that just eat ugali 3 times a day, and sometimes have a vegetable. And are they in the hungry?
Those generally, this is the extreme hunger. So those people generally won't be in it. These are the people that are basically don't have food. So you have, this is chronic hunger. You have, so this is basically the narrowest definition. Complete. So this number is bigger if you include people like, that you're referring to that don't have a broader variety of food.
This is where the dying goes on.
Yes, this is the immediate. Yes, so it's much larger if you look at that. It's close to 1 billion people if you're looking at just sort of the broader, which you would think of going hungry. On the other side, we have obesity rising, which is also a huge demand on resources. Here, I think this is an interesting figure that just came out. In the United States, if you see this little sliver here, we make up about 6% of the world's population. On the other side, you can see that in terms of mass, we're 34% of the world's body weight. Asia here makes up 61% of the world's population, yet it only is that little sliver of, I think, 13% of the world's body weight. So, looking out into the future, obesity is not just a health concern that many nations are dealing with, it's also a resource concern. And this phenomenon is not unique to the United States, although these are the numbers that we pulled out here. You're also seeing obesity rising all across the world. Especially in sort of Latin America right now and Brazil, and sort of the advanced developing countries. So as they're moving up in the income brackets, you're seeing people that are able to buy more food, and it seems to be a trend that is on the rise that I haven't seen any really good solutions to yet. So no one ever offers this. Okay, this is what you were talking about. Over time, especially since the 90s, we've really seen pretty stable food prices. There's been great amounts of output, and the prices have been relatively stable and relatively cheap. In 2007, 2008, we saw a huge price spike, both in nominal and real terms. And basically, overnight, people could not afford food. And in just that 1 year, we saw rice prices increase more than 200%. And corn and wheat prices doubled. These are staple crops for much of the world's population. So this really is what brought, I think, food security back into the news a couple years ago. This, I thought, was an interesting graph The Economist put out a little bit ago that looked at the cost of a pancake in different countries. And this really drives home how food products vary across countries. So to make a pancake in Japan, it's super expensive, yet in India, you can get the inputs of butter, flour, milk, and eggs at a cheaper rate. Now, if you were to, make something else, it could be a complete opposite. So I think one of the important things about achieving a more food-secure world is making it so prices don't vary so much across country. When food is traded on the open market, you can have more stable and uniform prices.
how much are you taking external conditions into consideration when you do these graphs, such as drought or war or corruption, government corruption, things like that, that the people really have no control over?
I think you just hit on a huge thing. There's only so much that that markets determine, and that's sort of my next piece. This was just a one day in time. It was the average price of these ingredients in 2011. I think one of the biggest determinants of food prices is not just supply, and it's not just demand. It's all the other variety of issues that you listed, which we can go into a little bit more. Yes?
Are you sensing another spike this year in 2012?
Wow, the million-dollar question. We have seen food prices spike in 2011, and then they leveled off.
Yeah.
And the output for the major commodities is expected to be good this year. There's a few. We'll go through this. There's a few major. I'll go through this. A few major producers, but it's really hard to say. I think right now, if you're just looking at outlook for supply, things are okay. But that is assuming that there are no major disasters or no major wars, or energy prices remains fairly stable.
Are you looking at commodity levels, or are you looking at supermarket prices?
This is on the commodity level. It ties, directly to supermarket prices.
Transportation.
Yes. Well, it does. The end cost, yes, it does. When you're looking at the cost of a final product, it takes into account transportation prices, all the inputs, seed prices, fertilizer, land tenure. It takes in everything into account. Yeah. So let me see here. So as you saw before in the previous graph with the sort of generally stable food prices and output, this has really been from decades of widespread improved use of seeds and fertilizer and better water management and farm management techniques. I thought this was an interesting piece, and you can't really see it in this graph, but across the United States it's written that we're able to produce 5.3 times the amount we did in 1910 using just 1.4 the number of inputs. So we've really become much more productive without, using more land or more water or more fertilizer. We just are, we know better how to apply it. We've developed better seeds, better management techniques. So I think this is an interesting statistic, and this is why essentially we've been able up until this point to produce more food and keep prices relatively stable. This is another picture of just, you can see how much productivity has increased from the late 19th century until 2007. And this is just a few of the crops. Obviously, tobacco and cotton aren't food crops, but you've seen increases in productivity overall. I thought I wanted to give just a couple pictures of where the big producing countries are. So the U.S. produces almost 40% of the world's corn, and it's by far the largest producer, followed by Brazil and then Argentina. And in 2011, the soybean production it's a little bit more evenly split between U.S., Brazil, and Argentina. But the fact that three countries still produce, close to 80% of the world's soybeans is, it goes back to what someone was asking about if they're for the outlook for 2012 of food prices. If any of these countries was to experience wipeout of one of their crops, it would really, change food prices. Most people don't expect that, so I'm not going to give the doom and gloom prediction, but you will hear that occasionally. It is a possibility. So if you take all these trends that we've just talked about and extrapolate to the future, we're going to need to increase food production by estimates of 70% in order to feed a world of 9.3 billion people in in 2050. Despite the increases in agricultural productivity that we've seen over the last, couple hundreds of years, I've seen estimates that we're going to have to produce as much food in the next 50 years as we have in the last 10,000 years. So that just can kind of contextualize the level of demand that we're going to be facing and how quickly we're going to have to meet that demand. By 2050, we're going to have to go from producing 2.1 billion tons of cereals to 5.1 billion tons. From 270 million tons of meat to 470. So that's sort of the outlook. Here I wanted to talk about some of the big constraints that could either hamper or help us meet those demands. Arable land, water and energy, market and infrastructure, and the environment. So like I just mentioned, we're going to have to produce 70% more food basically on the same amount of land. Right now we use about 12% of the world's land to produce food, and we're really, for a number of reasons, shouldn't go beyond that. One is environmental. We don't want to further deforest the world to produce agricultural commodities. But two, with the growing population and urbanization, we are really not going to be able to take up more of the land. And then a large part of the world's land is not able to cultivate food crops without really degrading it with massive amounts of fertilizer and stuff like that.
What about growing food not using land? Because you can grow it in liquid.
Yes.
And you can make all kinds of graphings and come up with tomatoes that taste like grapes and grapes that taste like something else and all this other business. So not necessarily using land, why not increase your technological use of this chemical and grow more food using the chemical?
I'll get to that a little bit later in the presentation, but that's definitely, I think, one of the solutions to the challenges we're facing. That, and you're also seeing increases in sort of like urban farming, where you're seeing people growing food on their balconies or on rooftops or in between buildings. And I think the New York Times has recently done a few little exposés on this. That is, all of these pieces are really important to global food security. I think the big takeaway is not one of them is going to solve the issue. Oops, I'm pushing backwards. Sorry. Okay, so one of the big opportunities and constraints are trade and markets. So say we are able to produce all this food to feed 9.3 billion people. That's great. We actually produce enough food right now to feed everyone, where no one should be going hungry. But one of the big problems is getting the food into people's hands. So no matter how productive you become, it's not going to help if, one, farmers can't get their goods to market and sell them and make a profit, and two, those goods then can't make it into the hands of consumers. So this is really a key choke point and a key opportunity for improving food security. Right now, just about 12% of the world's food crosses borders, imported or exported. That number's up drastically from early 2000s. It was about 6%. So we're already seeing increases in trade, but there's still a lot of challenges in that area that need to be overcome. One example of the importance of trade and markets is what we saw a few years ago in Russia when they enacted an export ban. Russia produces about 12% of the world's wheat crops, and they had huge wildfires that wiped out a bunch of their crops. And the Russian government imposed an export ban where they wouldn't allow any wheat out of the country. And overnight, you saw wheat prices on the global market rise 10% by just one country enacting an export ban. In 2008, keep hitting the wrong button. In 2008, after those food price spikes that we saw with the graph when it went really high, you saw a bunch of countries enact export bans. So they just decided it was for reasons for domestic security and to protect their populations and for fear and a bunch of other reasons, they would not let any food out of the country. Well, this just made prices go up even further, and basically overnight people could no longer afford food or find food. And this wasn't taking place. This was taking place around the world, not just in the usual suspect countries. I mean, you saw this in Italy and Mexico, Egypt, prior to this actually. And some people point to the food price spikes of 2007, 2008 and being sort of a driver in some of the Arab Spring activities. I think it was just, I personally think that's a little bit overstated, but I do think it was a contributing factor when you have massive amounts of people in cities that can't access affordable food. It's just one more thing. They don't have jobs, they're educated. It's just another driver to cause revolution. So food security definitely can be also a national security issue. Another key barrier is also infrastructure. In Sub-Saharan Africa, about 70% of their population relies on agriculture for their livelihoods. Yet they have huge deficits in their infrastructure to get their products to market. So only about 40% of Africans live within 2 kilometers of well-seasoned road, not even a paved road. So you can imagine if you're trying to get your goods to market, if you can't even get to a road, what a big issue that is. All of Sub-Saharan Africa produces the same amount of electricity as about all of Spain. So when you think about sort of the disparities there, and agriculture should be a big, and it is, but it could be even bigger in Africa. So some of the estimates to meet infrastructure demands in Sub-Saharan Africa are $10 billion a year or $93 billion a year for the next 10 years. These are massive investments that many of the country governments can't afford to make, and then if they make them, the upkeep is also very expensive.
What's this?
Sub-Saharan Africa. Another big thing that we'll have to deal with in order to feed the growing population is cutting down on post-harvest loss. As I mentioned before, we actually produce enough food, more than enough food to feed the country, feed the world. But much of this is lost post-harvest. So estimates range between 30 and 50%. Say we use 30%. They say about half of it is post-harvest loss. So you harvest your tomatoes, but then you don't know how to store them properly and they rot, or they get damaged during shipping. So they're lost from farm to market. The other half of that figure is what we call plate waste. So it's the food you throw away from your house. It's the food that gets wasted at restaurants. So just being able to address those two issues, would give significant, would be able to significantly improve the food security. Another big resource challenge is water. On average, it takes about 3,000 liters of water to feed one person for one day. And in 2030, we're going to need 30% more water than we use right now. Agriculture is currently the largest consumer of water at 70%. Industry and cities are the next 2 largest. And as we've talked about with some of the demographic changes, industry and cities are probably going to become even bigger consumers of water. So agriculture will really have to rely on using the same amount or hopefully less water. Here is another picture of sort of the 3 biggest consumers of water is the U.S., India, and China. The U.S. by far in the lead. And then I thought this was interesting to just show, this goes into sort of the cost of more processed goods too, is to produce a kilogram of wheat, it's 1,500 liters of water, but to produce a kilogram of beef, it's 15,000 liters. So that's where you're seeing some of the cost changes. Another big driver of food prices is fuel prices. They're closely linked, as you can see. As fuel rises, so does food, and this is for a number of reasons. one of the big things that you probably hear about a lot in the news is that as fuel prices rise, food crops are diverted to produce biofuels. That has been sort of a key link. Another is that it's actually, as fuel prices go up, it's more expensive to produce food. It's more expensive to harvest it, to provide fertilizer. And then finally, it's more expensive to transport it. So that's where, those are a few of the reasons why these are so closely linked. And you can see sort of as energy prices have increased from 2008, 2009 to 2010, 2011, the U.S. has diverted from 30% of its corn goes to biofuels, and now it's 40%. So that's just been a huge shift, and that trend is sort of expected to, I think, remain stable right now. Aside from some of these other challenges is both crop diseases and pests. One example is wheat stem rust, UG99, because it originated in Uganda, but we're starting to see it spread across some of the biggest wheat-producing countries of Iran, Turkey, India, and Pakistan, and Afghanistan, and which they produce about 20% of the world's wheat. The U.S. is also extremely vulnerable. We haven't seen this disease yet enter the U.S., but 80% of the U.S.'s wheat crops are vulnerable to this. And since we're such a huge producer of wheat, that's also something that we will need to overcome. Now, to get to the bright side of things, it's not all bad. There is, hope for the future. We are seeing a lot of investments in technology. We have since the 1970s, we saw a huge spike, and that's when we saw the Green Revolution really take root in India and a lot of South Asia and East Asia. Investments in transgenic crops, so developing better seeds through biotechnology or through genetic modification. And you can see here the number of acres that are planted across the world. As you see at the top, Africa is sort of that smallest sliver, and most people predict that that is the region that has the most capacity to really increase their productivity. So for the U.S., we use the best technology available and have the best, globally managed farm management techniques. So our productivity probably won't increase substantially, but in areas like Africa where they are, not even 10% of their crops are using any type of improved seed, you really could see big gains by adopting, various technologies. So there is hope for the future. I think aside from improved seed technology, you're also seeing a rolling out and a wider use of biofortified crops, so crops that have been conventionally bred to contain higher levels of provitamin A, zinc, iron. So if you're just eating maize, you'll eat orange maize and you will get your provitamin A. Those crops are being rolled out, and the health impacts are really being seen already. Also, we're seeing a broader understanding and use of the importance of sustainable farm management and water management, which is helping to improve food production. And then also at the policy level, food security has really been an agenda item on many of the global leaders, both the developed world and developing world. It was on both the agendas of the G8 and G20 summits that just occurred in the past few months. And for something like that to be on the agenda when you're also seeing some of the nuclear issues or other big security issues on the agenda is really important. And it's also really refreshing to know that countries are thinking about this. And I think that's the end. So I'd be happy to talk more and answer any questions. And yes.
How does the proliferation of free trade impact food security? For instance, with the U.S. growing so much wheat, does the fact that there's no trade barriers for that wheat to go to Mexico or Canada create any disincentives for anybody that might be able to grow wheat there?
With food, one of the big issues is more of a food safety issue. So commodities like this, like wheat, get traded on the global market. But especially for fruits and vegetables and meat, there's really rigorous standards that a lot of countries have in order to import a food. So one of the big challenges is the sanitary standards that countries need to meet and farmers need to meet. So the U.S. The U.S. and Europe have the most stringent safety protocols to import food. So if a farmer in Africa wants to export food to Europe, one of the big things is making sure they meet all of these safety standards. And so a big part of the investment that we're seeing now from a lot of developed countries is investment on capacity building. So teaching farmers how to properly store and package and distribute their food, but also teaching them to create the regulatory mechanisms in country to ensure that their food is safe. Technically, it is free trade, but there are huge trade barriers. Yeah, I mean the trade barriers are vast, and that's one of the biggest things that we actually need to overcome. And there's not really a lot of good ideas out there right now for that. Yes.
What about the role of subsidies? As long as these subsidies that they're undercutting the local African farmer, it's cheaper to actually import the food than it is for them to grow their own food.
Yes, that's a very good point. And this also gets a little bit into the debate over food aid. Traditionally, the U.S. and a lot of Europe and other countries have, in times of emergency, have shipped over food. So you're spending all that money to put food on a boat and send it over to Africa when, say, you're in Somalia and you need food and Kenya has food. Instead of going to Kenya and buying food there and just shipping it across the border, which would make sense, the way our food and farm bill is designed is that for so many years we were not doing local purchase. They're trying to do revisions on that, which would make a huge difference. The World Food Program is also starting to purchase food on the local market instead of shipping it from other countries. I think that'll make that's a big difference. Part of the thing with the trade barriers, it's also an infrastructure challenge. So if your neighboring country has food, but you can't get it there because of roads and other issues, or that's one of the big issues. But you're right, it does drive up. In many cases, it is cheaper to buy food.
When you talk about new technologies, does that include genetically engineered foods or irradiated food, things like that? Are you
It does.
teaching when you include that in your technology, are you working with companies to make that a safe process? Because you keep hearing all of these things, I'm not going to eat food that's been
Yes.
radiated or genetic, I want natural food and things
Right.
like that. So is there a mindset that you have to get people into in order to push that?
Well, it's funny. We've just launched a project looking at attitudes in East Africa towards genetically modified foods. The way we view it at CSIS is that genetic modification is basically the end of a long chain of agricultural technologies. Africa's here. Genetic modification is here. Even if you gave them genetically modified seeds right now, if you don't use them with the proper fertilization and water and seed, you're not going to see any benefits. You're not going to see an increase in productivity. I think the way the U.S. government approaches this issue right now is that if a country wishes to adopt genetically modified or genetically engineered food, that they will work with them to build the regulatory systems and to build the internal capacity to deal with that. And they will provide investment and training in those areas. But I think one of the big things is sort of picking the low-hanging fruit for a lot of these countries that, in the United States, I think it's a different ball game. Most of the corn we produce, or most of the wheat we produce, is GM wheat and corn. But in some of these other countries, the average is it takes 20 years to get the regulatory system in place to end up using genetically modified foods. So this is a debate we're having now, but not for something that could actually be implemented for, in some cases, 20 years. I think one of the big things you hit upon is getting out good information, information that's science-based and it's not so much just inflammatory. I mean, a lot of the GM debate is not really grounded in good research. You have people from the fringes on both sides. The voices are the loudest. Yes.
Is it true that there are some farms that are considered national security sites? I come from upstate New York, and there is a large family-owned farm that's about a half-mile away from me. It raises chickens specifically for vaccines.
Oh, okay.
Okay? And since 2001, I'm there all the time. I've seen this influx of money, and there's an American flag now, and there's a security. I mean, we're talking major rural area.
Yeah. I mean, that for food, there isn't necessarily national security farms, but you are probably talking about for the national stockpiles for certain vaccines that are only produced in chicken eggs. I think the influenza vaccine. So in that case, you might be able to use the national security argument. On food, basically for WTO, World Trade Organization regulations, you can enact an export ban if you feel like your population is going to be threatened if you export food. I think there's trying to establish mechanisms that make it a little harder to do that because in most cases, countries enact those bans much earlier than would ever be necessary. So I don't think there's actually national security farms except for related to the vaccine production.
The vaccines.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Yes.
Something that I've heard new is the countries like Saudi Arabia buying up land in other countries so they can guarantee a food supply to their particular country later on. How is that impacting any efforts made right now by the Global Food Security Project?
Well, it's a very difficult debate because there is a lot of land, and most of this is happening in Africa, where countries or companies are going in and purchasing large tracts of land to use to either eventually make a profit off of, in the case of companies, or to feed their own population. A lot of this land is land that either is not being utilized or could be utilized better to become more productive. If these types of agreements are structured properly, where both the host country and the investor, if they can work out, local land tenure rights, if they can work out local labor issues, if you can have an end to these agreements, if you structure the agreement right, it's possible to have these types of investments that don't necessarily hurt local farmers and hurt local countries and have these, huge land grabs is what people are calling them. It's still sort of early to tell. This is a rising phenomenon, and I think a lot of the developed country, the U.S. government and the European governments are spending a lot of time trying to help countries that are interested in selling land to structure these agreements so at least they won't, hurt their populations and hurt their future productivity. It's a really technical and difficult issue to grapple with, but I don't think you can completely discount the potential benefits of it. I think on the whole right now you've seen more harm than good, but I think if the proper safety mechanisms are put in place and the agreements are structured properly, it can actually be
more like Ethiopia, one of those nations that you have listed here, is giving up that land to other countries, and it's not going to be available to feed their own population because a global corporation has come in and bought up.
Well, in some cases, they have to structure the agreement so X percentage of the food will be made available to the local population first. That's just sort of one example of how they could make these types of agreements useful. Because the other thing is, if a company comes in and invests, and they have the money and the technology to go from basically turning an unproductive farm into a big, very productive exporter, then you're going from essentially having nothing to having a ton of food. And if you can use some of that food locally, then you're actually increasing the local food security. But it's still very early in the process of the land grab issues. But I think it's probably a little bit more, there's a little bit more nuance to it than I think the way it's been portrayed in the news. That it's not all bad, we're all good. Yes?
I'm actually not a teacher, but I'm
Sure.
a student. I'm an intern with the World Risk Council.
Great.
And we study a lot. I go to university here. I've noticed a lot of trends between gender and food security. For example, putting money in the hands of women allows them to buy food that will effectively provide nutrition for their families because they're women, because, for example, men in Sub-Saharan Africa spend that money, that little $3 a day on
differently.
beer and things like that. So I was wondering if this CSIS food security project has done any work with, finding insights and other correlations between gender and food security and seeing if that actually has an impact on bettering food utilization, I guess.
Yeah, you draw on a really important point that I left out of the presentation, but right now, basically all of the investments that are being made in food security by various governments, one of the big points is that it goes to, that they look at the role of women farmers. In Africa, I think 70% of the farmers are women. So, you have to design tools, for example, that women can use. Some types of things that, yes, it's great, they're wonderful, but a woman can't carry around this big piece of equipment with a baby tied to her back. So gender is being more and more considered in the investments that are being made, and also with the food choices. They've noticed when they give small loans to women in developing countries that they both repay loans more quickly and start to earn a profit more quickly. This is, people say this for a variety of reasons, but they end up investing the money into their family. I think that since, many cultures, women are tasked with providing nutritious food for their families and taking care of the domestic side of things, that in the return on investments in women is seen because then they're placed that way. But I think it's important not to forget the role of men in these economies, and I think that the U.S. government at least has gotten a little pushback after its initial announcement of such an importance on the role of women, which there is, but that the men play such an important part in the household, and also if they go to the city to work, that this is just one piece of the coin, but it's essential to focus on gender.
Just one quick observation to defend the men. Now keep in mind that beer is also food. It's part of the concentrate. And
It's
since
true.
we can't carry around the baby all day, we carry about the beer.
Carry a beer butt.
No, I was just curious because it's something we study a lot in school, so I was just curious if there were any actual studies on this.
Yes, there's tons, and basically all of the new investment plans from all the developed countries include a big piece on the role of women, and all the international, like the World Bank and the FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization, all include an important component on focusing on women and investing in women, since they've sort of been the forgotten piece in agriculture, though they carry out a lot of the work and do a lot of the harvesting. Yes, they should get some of that too. Anything else? Well, great. Well, thank you. I'm so glad to talk to you all.